Some say Ashtabula, Ohio, is a place where things come to be forgotten, a final sigh on the shores of Lake Erie. I think they're right. It's where I came, hoping the relentless gray sky and the drone of the ore carriers might eventually scour away the image of Danny's small hand slipping from mine that day at the county fair. 10 years. 10 years of that moment replaying behind my eyelids every time I tried to find peace. The guilt was a living thing, a parasite nestled deep, and I fed it with solitude and the mundane rhythm of a life I didn't much care to live. The Spin and Fold, a 24-hour laundromat on the anemic pulse of what used to be downtown, offered me the graveyard shift, and I took it without a second thought. Anonymity, a paycheck, and the dead hours of the night, it was all I asked for, or perhaps all I felt I deserved. The Spin and Fold wasn't just old, it felt ancient, a relic from a time when Ashtabula hummed with a different kind of life. The linoleum floor, a sickly yellow, was cracked like old parchment, mapped with the ghosts of 1,000 spills. Fluorescent lights, some flickering with a nervous energy, cast a pallid, interrogative glow over rows of hulking washers and dryers, their once gleaming chrome now dulled to a pewter resignation. The air was a permanent cocktail of stale bleach, damp fabric, and an underlying metallic tang I couldn't quite place. The breath of tired machinery, perhaps, or something older. Something that had seeped into the very foundations of the building. It was a place where the silence was never truly silent, always punctuated by the hum of a distant motor, the gurgle of a drain, or the click of a cooling drum. My apartment was a small, cheerless box above a closed-down bakery a few blocks away, but the laundromat became my true residence, the mausoleum where I interred my waking hours. The customers during the deep night were few and far between. Weary third-shifters, insomniacs with armfuls of regret woven into their laundry, the occasional lost soul seeking a moment's shelter from the biting lake wind. Most of them barely made eye contact, their faces drawn and shadowed, mirroring the exhaustion that had become my own constant companion. I'd sweep the floors, wipe down the folding tables, empty the lint traps, mindless tasks that allowed my thoughts to drift, though they never drifted far from that sun-drenched afternoon, the laughing crowd, the sudden, sickening realization that Danny was gone. I never spoke of Danny to anyone in Ashtabula. It was a stone I carried in my gut, too heavy to share, too jagged to ever forget. This town, with its own quiet desolation, seemed to understand the need for secrets, for pasts best left undisturbed. The Spin and Fold, in particular, felt like a confessional for the unspoken. Each abandoned sock, each forgotten sweater, a silent testament to lives interrupted. I sometimes wondered about the previous night shift attendant, what specters they had wrestled with in the hum and shadow of this place. The employee turnover, according to the scrawled notes on the break room calendar, was notable. People didn't seem to last long under the flickering neons and the ceaseless churning. The building itself seemed to breathe, not in a living way, but with the slow, mechanical sighs of something enduring beyond its intended lifespan. The walls, painted a drab, institutional green, sometimes felt as if they were watching, the faint water stains on the ceiling tiles resembling half-closed eyes. I'd catch myself staring into the dark maws of the silent washing machines, half expecting to see a reflection that wasn't my own, or to hear a whisper just below the threshold of audibility. It was the kind of place that encouraged such fancies, where the mundane could easily curdle into the unsettling if you let your mind wander too far into the quiet, pre-dawn hours. The scent of ozone, sharp and clean, would sometimes cut through the usual laundromat smells, usually after a particularly violent thunderstorm, or sometimes for no discernible reason at all, hanging in the air like an unspoken warning. I learned to appreciate the rhythm of the graveyard shift, the way the city outside slowly exhaled its last breath of activity and settled into an uneasy slumber. Inside the spin-and-fold, however, there was always a low thrum of potential, a sense that the machines were merely resting, biding their time. The rows of dryers, with their circular glass doors like vacant eyes, seemed particularly sentient. I'd find myself tracing the patterns of dust on their surfaces, the way the faint light from the street lamps outside would catch on the smudges, creating fleeting, distorted faces. It was a lonely vigil, but loneliness had become a familiar cloak, one I wore without complaint, a penance for a moment of inattention that had cost everything. The previous attendant had left behind a few tattered paperbacks in the small, cramped office, mostly pulpy detective novels, and a surprisingly dense book on local Ashtabula folklore, its pages dog-eared and spine-cracked. I skimmed through it one particularly slow night, reading about old superstitions, local legends of the lake, and tales of places where the veil between worlds was supposedly thin. The spin-and-fold wasn't mentioned by name, but a passage about buildings that collect sorrows like lint snagged my attention. It spoke of how intense emotions, especially grief and loss, could leave an imprint, an echo that resonated long after the source was gone, sometimes other echoes. I dismissed it as fanciful nonsense, the product of an overactive imagination. Still, there was an undeniable weight to the place, a sense of accumulated history that went beyond the mere age of the building. The rhythmic clatter of coins into slots, the whirring crescendo of the spin cycle, the warm sigh of a dryer finishing its task, these were the surface sounds. Beneath them, I sometimes felt I could almost hear a different kind of machinery at work, something far more intricate and far less benign. It was the feeling you get when you're walking alone in an old house at night and a floorboard creaks upstairs. You tell yourself it's just the house settling, but a deeper, more primal part of you isn't quite so sure. My first week passed in a blur of bleach fumes and exhaustion. I memorized the locations of the cleaning supplies, the quirks of the coin machine, the best way to wrestle a stubborn load of wet denim from a front loader. I was just another cog, another anonymous face keeping the wheels turning through the desolate hours. I told myself this was what I wanted, a life stripped bare, a routine so monotonous it might eventually grind down the sharp edges of my grief. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the only sound was the lonely hum of a single dryer tumbling a forgotten load, I would look at my own reflection in its dark glass door and wonder if Danny would even recognize the hollowed-out man I had become. And I'd wonder, with a chill that had nothing to do with the Ohio night, what else this place might collect besides dirty laundry. It was on a Tuesday, a little over a week into my tenure at the Spin-and-Fold, that the mundane first began to fray at the edges. The night had been unremarkable, the usual trickle of late-night stragglers having long since departed, leaving me to the company of the humming machines and my own restless thoughts. Silas Blackwood, the night manager, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of 1,000 sleepless nights, had been even more taciturn than usual when he'd arrived to relieve the evening shift. He was a creature of routine, his movements economical, his words sparse, as if conserving energy for some unseen, ongoing battle. He rarely looked me in the eye, his gaze usually fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, or scanning the rows of machines with a kind of weary vigilance. That night, however, as he was preparing to retreat into the small windowless office that served as his nocturnal den, he paused by the main counter where I was idly wiping down a coffee stain. He produced a folded, yellowed sheet of paper from the breast pocket of his faded work shirt, the creases so deep they looked like scars. "Maxwell," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant machinery. "Nightly essentials. Read 'em, follow 'em, no questions." He placed the paper on the counter, his calloused fingers lingering on it for a moment, as if reluctant to let it go, or perhaps to pass on its burden. The sheet was surprisingly heavy, the paper thick and fibrous, almost like a piece of old linen itself. I unfolded it cautiously. The title, "Procedural Nightly Essentials, the Spin and Fold," was typed on what looked like an ancient typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, some fainter than others. Beneath it, a numbered list of instructions, each one more peculiar than the last. 1. After 11 p.m., dryer number 7, the 7th sigh, must remain empty. Its door is to be left ajar, no less than 3 inches, no more than 4. 2. Should a single unpaired crimson sock manifest within the primary lost and found receptacle, basket A, beneath counter, it is not to be handled directly. Report its appearance to the manager on duty immediately. Under no circumstances attempt to pair it. 3. At precisely 1:11 a.m., 1 capful of Lily Valley fabric softener, stock designation LV Blue, located rear supply closet, top shelf, left, must be decanted directly into the central floor drain of the main service sink. No other brand, no other time. A cold laugh almost escaped me. It sounded like a hazing ritual, some elaborate prank designed for the new guy on the graveyard shift. But one look at Silas Blackwood's face, devoid of any humor, his eyes like chips of granite, and the laugh died in my throat. There was a gravity about him, a profound seriousness that brooked no argument. This wasn't a joke. This was something else entirely. Something that resonated with the unsettling undercurrent I'd already begun to sense in this place. The specificity of the rules, the almost ritualistic language, sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the draft seeping in from under the main door. I looked back at the list, a knot tightening in my stomach. The list continued, each rule more bizarre than the last. 4. If the scent of burnt sugar becomes pronounced in the vicinity of washers 10 through 12 between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m., activate the industrial exhaust fan, switch B, breaker panel, for no less than 7 minutes, regardless of ambient temperature. Do not investigate the source of the odor. 5. Any garments found still damp after a full standard drying cycle in dryer number 3, the Weeper, are to be re-dried only once. If still damp, they are to be sealed in a clear biohazard bag, stock BH Clear, and placed in the locked, damaged textiles bin. Do not attempt a third drying. The names assigned to the machines, the 7th sigh, the Weeper, were unsettling in their own right, suggesting a history, a personality almost, that went beyond mere mechanics. I swallowed, the air in my lungs suddenly feeling thick, heavy like wet wool. "Silas," I began, but he cut me off with a curt shake of his head. "Just do 'em, Maxwell. Every night, no exceptions, for your own good and for the good of the place." He turned then, without another word, and disappeared into the dimness of the office, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound of finality. I was left alone with the list, the hum of the dryers suddenly seeming louder, more insistent, each rotation a tick of some unseen clock counting down to what? The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz with a nervous, almost mocking energy. I reread the rules, my hand trembling slightly. It was absurd. Pouring fabric softener down a drain at a specific time? Leaving a dryer door ajar? It felt like the nonsensical superstitions of a madman. Yet, Silas's demeanor, the sheer, unyielding conviction in his eyes, was deeply unsettling. I thought back to the folklore book, the passage about places that collected sorrows. Could these rules be some strange local custom, a way of appeasing something? The idea was ludicrous, but in the sterile, echoing silence of the spin-and-fold at nearly midnight, with the shadows in the corners seeming to deepen and stretch, it didn't feel quite as outlandish as it should have. It was then, as I stood there, the list clutched in my hand, that I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, on one of the long Formica folding tables, a neatly folded stack of pale blue towels seemed to shift. Just a fraction of an inch, a subtle realignment, as if settling more comfortably. There was no draft. The main doors were closed, the HVAC system dormant for the night. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. It could have been my tired eyes, a trick of the flickering light. But then, a single towel at the top of the stack seemed to unfurl one of its corners, slowly, deliberately, like a sighing breath being released. It lay there for a moment, the corner extended, before just as slowly it folded back in on itself. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked around wildly, half expecting to see someone, a hidden prankster. But the laundromat was empty, filled only with the cold, impassive stares of the machines. The towels lay still now, a perfect, undisturbed stack. Had I imagined it? Sleep deprivation? The power of suggestion from that damned list? I didn't know, but a cold dread, sharp and visceral, began to seep into me, far more potent than the lingering scent of bleach. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was something else. And the strange rules on the paper in my hand suddenly felt less like a prank and more like a lifeline in very deep, very dark water. The night, I realized, was only just beginning. The first few nights after receiving Silas's list were a masterclass in feigned nonchalance and internal panic. I performed the rituals with a meticulousness born of a growing, gnawing fear. At 11 p.m. sharp, dryer number 7, the 7th sigh, would be checked, its door nudged to that precise 3 to 4 inch gap, a silent sentinel in the row of otherwise dormant machines. The air around it always felt colder, I noticed, and sometimes I thought I could hear a faint, almost inaudible whisper, like static on a distant radio, emanating from its drum. I told myself it was the old motor, the building settling, anything but what my gut was starting to scream at me. The crimson sock, thankfully, remained absent from basket A, a small mercy in a landscape of escalating unease. The 1:11 a.m. fabric softener ritual became a focal point of my nightly dread. The rear supply closet was a cramped, dusty space, smelling of old cardboard and forgotten chemicals. The blue bottle of Lily Valley always seemed to be in the exact same spot, as if untouched by human hands between my nightly visits. Measuring out that single capful, the sickly sweet scent of artificial lilies filling my nostrils, then walking to the main service sink, its porcelain stained and chipped, felt like an offering to some unseen, fastidious deity. The gurgle as the blue liquid disappeared down the drain was always followed by a profound silence, a brief, loaded pause in the laundromat's usual symphony of hums and clicks, as if the entire building were holding its breath. One night, I was a few minutes late with the softener, delayed by a customer who'd managed to jam the coin slot on a washer. It was 1:14 a.m. when I finally poured the blue liquid. As it vanished, instead of the usual quiet, a low groan echoed from the pipes, a sound like something large and heavy shifting in the building's bowels. Then, 3 of the overhead fluorescent lights in the main aisle flickered violently and died, plunging a significant section of the spin-and-fold into a deeper, more oppressive gloom. My heart leaped into my throat. Coincidence, or a direct consequence of my tardiness? Silas emerged from his office, his face unreadable in the dim light, surveyed the darkened aisle, and simply said, "Breaker panel, reset 'em, and don't be late again, Maxwell." His tone left no room for doubt. The incident with the crimson sock finally occurred on a Thursday. I was wiping down the folding tables, the scent of bleach sharp in my nostrils, when I glanced towards basket A. There it was, a single, vibrant red sock, nestled amongst a few faded gray ones and a child's forgotten mitten. It was a rich, arterial crimson, the color almost throbbing in the dim light. My stomach clenched. Under no circumstances attempt to pair it. The rule echoed in my mind. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the sock, then hurried to the office. Silas listened to my report, his expression unchanging, then nodded slowly. "Stay here," he instructed, and walked out. I heard him rummaging near the counter, then the distinct sound of tongs, metal against metal. A few minutes later he returned, his face pale. "It's dealt with," was all he said. I didn't dare ask how. Martha Thorne, who sometimes overlapped with my shift for a brief period during her own erratic comings and goings, became a source of cryptic, unsettling commentary. She was a woman whose age was hard to guess, her face a roadmap of worry lines, her eyes holding a kind of weary, seen-it-all cynicism. One morning, as the first hint of dawn was staining the eastern sky, she found me staring at dryer number 3, the Weeper, which had, once again, failed to fully dry a load of heavy towels despite 2 cycles. "Some things just hold on to the damp, dearie," she said, her voice raspy. "Like old sorrows. You can air 'em out, tumble 'em till kingdom come, but the chill stays deep in the fibers." She then added, almost as an afterthought, "This place, it likes things that hold on." The clothes themselves seemed to be developing a malevolent sentience. I'd be sorting a load, and a shirt sleeve would brush against my arm with a light, almost caressing touch, when there was no discernible movement. Or I'd find buttons undone that I was sure had been fastened, zippers slightly open. Small things, easily dismissed as oversight or imagination, but they accumulated, each tiny anomaly a pinprick in my resolve, a slow erosion of my sanity. The worst were the whispers, faint, sibilant, just at the edge of hearing. Sometimes they sounded like my name. Sometimes they sounded like Danny. I'd spin around, my heart pounding, but there was never anyone there. Just the relentless, indifferent hum of the machines. One night, the scent of burnt sugar, as described in rule number 4, filled the air around washers 10, 12. It was cloying, sickeningly sweet, with an acrid undertone that scraped the back of my throat. I rushed to the breaker panel, fumbling for switch B, my hands slick with sweat. As the industrial exhaust fan roared to life, I glanced towards the washers. For a split second, I thought I saw a faint orange glow from within the drum of washer 11, a flickering ember in the darkness. I slammed my eyes shut, turning away, the rule, "Do not investigate the source," screaming in my head. 7 minutes. 7 of the longest minutes of my life. The roar of the fan a counterpoint to the frantic thumping of my own heart. When the time was up and the fan silenced, the smell was gone, leaving only the cold, metallic tang of fear. The most disturbing moments, however, involved the subtle animations. A pair of jeans, discarded on a chair, would slowly slide to the floor, as if nudged by an invisible hand. A stack of neatly folded t-shirts would topple over with no apparent cause. Once, I watched, frozen, as a child's sock, tiny and striped, appeared to crawl a few inches across a folding table before stopping abruptly. These weren't aggressive acts, not yet, but they were undeniably wrong. They were a constant, low-level hum of the impossible, a quiet insistence that the reality I knew was a thin veneer over something far stranger and less accommodating. The spin and fold wasn't just a laundromat, it was a stage, and the clothes were no longer merely props. Silas remained an enigma. He moved through the laundromat with a weary acceptance, as if these nightly terrors were simply part of the job description, like unblocking a drain or mopping up a spill. He never offered explanations beyond the terse reinforcement of the rules. But sometimes I'd catch him staring at a particular machine or a pile of unclaimed garments with an expression that was more than just tired. It was a look of profound, almost sorrowful understanding, as if he were gazing into the heart of some ancient, intractable grief. And I began to wonder what price he had paid, what piece of himself he had left behind in the endless, churning nights at the spin and fold. The rules were a cage, perhaps, but what exactly were they trying to keep in or out? And what happened when the bars began to bend? The catalyst for a deeper, more terrifying understanding arrived in a cascade of cheap lace and faded floral print. A woman, her face etched with a frantic, sleepless energy, had rushed in near closing time for the day shift, thrusting a battered duffel bag onto the counter. "Wash and dry, delicate cycle, please. I'll be back tomorrow," she'd stammered, pressing a crumpled 20 into my hand before practically fleeing. Inside the bag, nestled amongst some ordinary blouses and slacks, was an old-fashioned party dress. It was a confection of pale pink and yellow flowers on a cream background, with a wide taffeta sash, the kind of thing a girl might have worn to a high school dance in a bygone era. It reeked faintly of old perfume and something else, something vaguely like dried tears. I processed the order, the dress feeling strangely cold to the touch despite the ambient warmth of the laundromat. After its delicate cycle, I placed it carefully on the hold for pickup shelf behind the counter. That night, as I was performing my rounds, I noticed it. The dress wasn't lying flat. One of the puffed sleeves seemed to be lifted, as if reaching. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but as I watched, the taffeta sash, which I had tied loosely, began to tighten, slowly, constricting around the waist of the dress like an invisible hand cinching a corset. My breath hitched. This was no subtle shift. This was a deliberate, sustained movement. The floral pattern on the fabric seemed to writhe, the pale pinks and yellows darkening as if bruised from within. I found Silas in the office, hunched over a dog-eared ledger. My voice was unsteady as I described what I'd seen. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the flickering security monitor that showed a grainy, black-and-white view of the main floor. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "The desfiados, Maxwell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The tattered ones, the unraveled." He finally looked at me, his eyes holding a bleakness that chilled me to the bone. "This place, it's a snag in the fabric of things, always has been. It catches what's left behind, strong emotions, echoes of lives, regrets, especially regrets. And sometimes those echoes, they get tangled, they get hungry," he explained, in halting, fragmented sentences, that the spin and fold wasn't just a place for washing clothes. It was a conduit, a place where the residue of human experience, joy, sorrow, love, but mostly pain, clung to the garments that passed through. Os desfiados, he called them, were these accumulated emotional imprints, these frayed ends of existence that, over time, had developed a kind of rudimentary, parasitic consciousness. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, he insisted, but something more elemental, something that fed on the lingering essence left in the fibers, growing stronger, more defined, with each new sorrow that entered the laundromat's orbit. The dress, with its potent aura of lost youth and forgotten dances, was a veritable feast for them. The rules, Silas elaborated, weren't arbitrary. They were a delicate, time-honed system of appeasement, of management. Think of it like static electricity, Maxwell. Too much buildup and you get a spark, a bad one. Leaving dryer number 7 ajar was like a pressure release valve. The fabric softener down the drain was an offering, a kind of psychic lubricant to soothe the agitated threads. The crimson sock? A knot, he said, his voice dropping. A tangle of particularly nasty intent. You don't want to pull on that thread. He then spoke of O Grande Emaranhado de 1968, the Great Tangle, a night when the static had become a storm. The details were hazy, lost to local legend and deliberate obfuscation, but the gist was clear. Several customers and the night attendant had simply vanished, swallowed by the machines, some whispered. Others said they'd been unraveled, their own life threads pulled apart and woven into the laundromat's grim tapestry. My blood ran cold. This was beyond anything I could have conceived. A laundromat that didn't just clean clothes, but fed on the sorrows embedded within them. Entities born from discarded emotions. Why? I managed to ask, my voice hoarse. Silas shrugged, a gesture of profound resignation. Some places are just thin, built on old hurts maybe, or maybe Abernathy, the fellow who built this place back in the 30s, knew something, or did something. The old-timers used to say he dabbled in things best left alone. He gestured vaguely towards the humming machines. They're not just washers and dryers, Maxwell. They're looms of a sort, constantly weaving, constantly collecting. The air in the small office felt suffocating. The implications of what Silas was saying were staggering. Every customer who walked through the door wasn't just bringing in dirty laundry. They were bringing in pieces of their lives, their pains, their losses, unwittingly feeding the spectral inhabitants of the spin and fold. And I, the night attendant, was the unwitting zookeeper, performing bizarre rituals to keep the beasts pacified. The memory of Danny, the raw, unhealed wound of his absence, suddenly felt like a beacon in this place, a glaring signal to these desfiados. Was my own grief adding to the hunger, making me a target, or perhaps a particularly appetizing morsel. Silas leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "The dress," he said. "It's a bad one. Got a strong echo. We need to contain it before it really wakes up." He explained that certain items saturated with particularly potent emotions could act as anchors, as focal points for the desviados, allowing them to manifest more coherently, more powerfully. The rules were designed to prevent such items from gaining too much traction, to keep the general hum of the place at a manageable if unsettling level. But this dress, he sensed, was different. It was old, its sorrow deeply ingrained, and something about its arrival now felt significant. As if on cue, a low, guttural moan emanated from the main floor, followed by the clatter of several metal hangers falling from the garment rack. I looked at the security monitor. The floral dress was no longer on the shelf. It was on the floor, in the center of the aisle, and it appeared to be twitching. The arrival of Alastair Finch coincided with the escalation of the dress's unsettling activity. He began frequenting the spin and fold during the deepest hours of my shift. A dapper, silver-haired man in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket and carrying a leather satchel. He introduced himself as a visiting folklorist, researching liminal spaces and memory retention in mundane architecture for a monograph. His initial inquiries were charmingly academic, focused on the history of Ashtabula, the socio-economic shifts, the kinds of stories that get woven into the fabric of a small industrial town. He had an easy smile, a cultured voice, and an uncanny ability to make you feel like the most interesting person in the room. Finch quickly became fascinated by the spin and fold, or rather, by my increasingly frayed accounts of its nocturnal peculiarities, which I let slip in carefully edited, sleep-deprived ramblings. He'd listen intently, his head tilted, making thoughtful notes in a small leather-bound journal. He never dismissed my experiences as mere fatigue or imagination. Instead, he'd offer alternative, quasi-scientific explanations. Residual psychometry, theories of spatial resonance, or the impact of low-frequency infrasound generated by aging industrial machinery on human perception. He made the terrifying sound plausible, almost mundane, a phenomenon to be studied, not feared. It was a seductive approach, especially when contrasted with Silas's grim, superstitious fatalism. Silas, predictably, detested Finch on sight. "A carrion crow, Maxwell," he'd muttered after Finch's first extended visit. "Smells the rot and circles, hoping for a scrap." He warned me, in no uncertain terms, to keep my distance, to reveal nothing of the true nature of the laundromat or the rules. "Men like him," Silas growled, "they don't respect boundaries. They poke and prod till they break something, then act surprised when it bites back." But Finch was persistent, and his intellectual curiosity was a balm to my own reeling mind. He offered a framework, a vocabulary for the madness, that felt less like succumbing to superstition and more like engaging with a complex, albeit unexplained, scientific puzzle. The internal conflict began to tear at me. On one hand, there was Silas, the grizzled veteran, his warnings steeped in years of first-hand experience, his rules the only bulwark against whatever the desafiados truly were. His world was one of grim adherence, of placating unseen forces through rote ritual. On the other, Finch offered understanding, a path to demystification. He spoke of harnessing these residual energies, of dialogue rather than appeasement. "Imagine, Leo," he'd said one night, his eyes gleaming with an almost fervent light, "if these echoes are indeed remnants of consciousness, what could we learn? What solace could be found, perhaps, for those left behind? He'd looked directly at me then, a subtle, knowing glance that seemed to pierce straight through to my festering grief over Danny. The floral dress became a focal point for their differing philosophies and for my own internal schism. Silas insisted on a strict containment protocol for it, keeping it isolated, wrapped in consecrated muslin, a new, disturbing addition to our supplies, and performing a nightly cleansing ritual involving burnt sage and salt water. Finch, however, argued for observation, for non-invasive interaction. He suggested leaving a voice-activated recorder near it, or even attempting a controlled trigger event, perhaps playing music from the era the dress likely originated from. "Fear is the enemy, Leo," he'd chided gently. "These are merely threads of the past. Why not try to understand their pattern?" My guilt over Danny, a constant, dull ache, became a raw, exposed nerve in Finch's presence. He never mentioned my brother directly, but his talk of unfinished conversations, of lingering connections seeking resolution, resonated deeply with my desperate, unspoken yearning for some kind of closure, some way to atone for that single, catastrophic lapse in attention. Was it possible, as Finch subtly implied, that Danny's echo was out there somewhere, caught in the static between worlds, and that understanding the Desfiados might, just might, offer a way to reach him? The thought was both terrifying and intoxicatingly hopeful, a dangerous lure in the desolate landscape of my grief. Silas, sensing my wavering resolve, became more agitated, his warnings more dire. "He's playing you, Maxwell. He doesn't care about your brother or anyone else's sorrow. He's a collector, like a man who collects venomous spiders. He admires their deadliness, but he doesn't understand the sting until it's too late." Martha Thorne, too, offered her own brand of bleak counsel. "Some doors, dearie," she'd croaked, observing Finch from afar one morning, "are best left unopened. And some folks are too keen to hand you the key just to watch what crawls out." Her words, usually easy to dismiss as the ramblings of a burnt-out cynic, now carried a chilling weight. The laundromat itself seemed to reflect my internal turmoil. The manifestations became more erratic, sometimes ceasing altogether for hours, only to return with a new, unsettling intensity. One night, all the washing machines on the left aisle started simultaneously, their empty drums spinning in a silent, ghostly ballet. Another time, the lost and found basket disgorged its entire contents onto the floor. The disparate items, socks, gloves, a child's faded drawing, arranging themselves into a crude, almost childlike approximation of a human figure. Finch documented these events with an almost gleeful detachment, while Silas grew increasingly gaunt, the lines around his eyes deepening into shadowed ravines. I found myself caught in a tug-of-war, my loyalty to Silas and the ingrained fear of the rules battling against the seductive logic and implied promise offered by Finch. The very air in the spin and fold felt charged, the silence between the hums and clacks pregnant with unspoken questions. Whose truth was I to believe? The grim pragmatism of the old guard, or the enlightened curiosity of the newcomer? And as I wrestled with this dilemma, the floral dress in its muslin shroud seemed to pulse with a faint, expectant energy, as if awaiting my decision, knowing that whichever path I chose would inevitably lead deeper into the heart of its own unraveling mystery. The threads of my own life were becoming inextricably tangled with those of the spin and fold, and I feared there was no easy way to cut myself free. The fragile equilibrium, the uneasy truce maintained by Silas's rigid adherence to the rules, was shattered by the arrival of Kevin. He was a young, fresh-faced kid, barely out of his teens, hired by the day manager to cover a few of Martha's increasingly frequent absences. Kevin possessed an almost aggressive brand of youthful cynicism, a sneering disdain for anything that smacked of superstition or tradition. He'd seen the list of nightly essentials pinned in the office and had openly scoffed, dismissing it as Old Man Blackwood's voodoo bullshit. Silas had warned him, his voice low and gravelly, but Kevin had just rolled his eyes, a smirk playing on his lips. He was, in short, a spark dropped into a room filled with dry tinder. The incident occurred on Kevin's third night shift, a night thick with an almost palpable tension, the air heavy and stagnant despite the chill blowing in from the lake. He'd brought his own laundry, a duffel bag overflowing with banned t-shirts and ripped jeans. Ignoring Silas's explicit, repeated instruction about dryer number 7, the seventh sigh, remaining empty and ajar after 11 p.m., Kevin had defiantly stuffed his clothes into its drum around midnight. For a few hours, nothing happened. Kevin lounged on one of the plastic chairs, headphones on, oblivious. Silas paced the periphery of the laundromat like a caged animal, his eyes darting constantly towards dryer No. 7, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles knotting beneath his skin. Around 3 a.m., the dryer clicked off. Kevin sauntered over, pulled open the door, and began to retrieve his clothes. That's when he screamed. It wasn't a loud scream, more of a choked, guttural cry of pure, unadulterated terror. I rushed over. He was standing frozen, his face a mask of chalky horror, his eyes wide and staring, not at his clothes, but at his own hands. Fine, almost invisible threads, the color of dust and shadows, were erupting from the cuffs of his band t-shirt, from the frayed edges of his jeans. They were coiling around his fingers, his wrists, like insidious living tendrils, pulling taut, digging into his skin. He tried to pull them off, but they seemed to cling, to burrow deeper. They're inside, he gasped, his voice cracking. Pulling from inside me. He stumbled back, clawing at his arms, his breath coming in ragged sobs. The threads were multiplying, weaving a grotesque cocoon around his hands and forearms, their ends disappearing back into the fabric of his own clothes as if they were an extension of the garments themselves. Silas was there in an instant, but even he seemed momentarily stunned by the horrifying spectacle. We found Kevin later, after the paramedics had taken him away, in the hospital's psychiatric wing. He was in a near catatonic state, his eyes vacant, his fingers still twitching as if trying to pluck away invisible filaments. The official report mentioned a severe psychotic break, possibly drug-induced. But I had seen the threads. Silas had seen them. They weren't a hallucination. They were a terrifying manifestation of the spin-and-fold's power, a direct, brutal consequence of a broken rule. The illusion that the rules were merely quaint eccentricities, or even just a system of gentle appeasement, was shattered. This was not a game. This was a war, and the enemy had just claimed a casualty in the most gruesome fashion. The night after Kevin's breakdown, the atmosphere in the spin and fold was electric with a malevolent energy. The usual subtle shifts and whispers were replaced by a more overt, almost aggressive activity. Machines would start and stop at random, their doors slamming open and shut with violent force. The lights flickered constantly, casting an erratic strobe-like effect that made the shadows dance and writhe. But the most terrifying moment came when I was sorting through a basket of newly washed clothes left by a customer. My hand brushed against something soft, familiar. I pulled it out. It was a small, knitted blue sweater with a distinctive pattern of yellow ducks. Danny's favorite, the one he was wearing the day he disappeared. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't seen that sweater in 10 years. It was packed away in a box in my mother's attic, hundreds of miles from Ashtabula. There was no conceivable way it could be here. Yet, here it was, in my hands, smelling faintly of dust and old cedar. And something else. Something that reminded me of the cloying sweetness of cotton candy from the county fair. As I stared at it, my mind reeling, the sweater twitched. Just a small, almost imperceptible movement. Then one of the tiny sleeves lifted, as if waving, beckoning. A whisper, so close it felt like it was breathed directly into my ear, hissed, "Leo, I'm cold, Leo. Come find me." It was Danny's voice, or a perfect, chilling imitation. I dropped the sweater as if it were on fire, stumbling back, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. This was no longer about abstract entities or general malevolence. This was personal. The Desviados, or whatever intelligence lurked within the fabric of this accursed place, knew me. They knew my deepest wound, my most vulnerable point. They were using Danny, using my love and my guilt as a weapon. The fragile sense of detachment I had tried to cultivate, the idea that I was just an observer, a reluctant caretaker, evaporated. I was no longer on the periphery. I was at the very center of the storm, and the threads were reaching for me. The rules, I suddenly realized with a sickening clarity, might keep the laundromat from tearing itself apart, but they offered no protection for me. My own sorrow was the bait, and I had walked right into the trap. The incident with Danny's sweater, followed so closely by Kevin's horrifying unraveling, marked a definitive shift in the spin and fold. It was as if a dam had broken, and the contained malevolence of years was now flooding the grimy, echoing space. The carefully constructed system of rules, Silas's nightly rituals of appeasement, seemed to crumble under the weight of a newly emboldened, more aggressive sentience. The subtle whispers escalated into distinct, mocking voices that echoed from the vents and the dark maws of the washing machines. They called my name. They murmured fragments of conversations I'd had years ago. They even hummed snatches of lullabies my mother used to sing to Danny. Each sound was a carefully aimed dart, designed to unnerve, to break me. The physical manifestations became bolder, more overtly threatening. Piles of clothes would spontaneously rearrange themselves into grotesque, vaguely human shapes that would collapse just as I turned to look directly at them. Washers and dryers would activate in violent, shuddering bursts, their doors banging open and shut like chattering teeth, sometimes spewing forth not clean laundry, but tangled masses of shredded fabric, reeking of mildew and something acrid like burnt hair. The air grew heavy, thick with a palpable sense of oppression, and the temperature would plummet unpredictably, even on relatively mild nights, my breath plumbing in front of me as if I were standing in a walk-in freezer. The rules felt increasingly like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a thimble. Silas, who had always seemed like an immovable fixture of weary resilience, began to show visible signs of strain. His usual stoicism fractured, revealing glimpses of a raw, desperate fear. He moved through the laundromat with a new hunted caution, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his hand often straying to a small, worn leather pouch he wore on a cord around his neck, something I'd never noticed before, something he now seemed to clutch like a talisman. It's stronger now, Maxwell," he admitted one night, his voice raspy, his gaze fixed on dryer number 7, which had begun to emit a low, rhythmic pulsing sound, like a giant, diseased heart. "The old ways, they're not holding. Something's changed. Something's feeding it. Alistair Finch, far from being deterred by the escalating chaos, seemed almost invigorated by it. He arrived nightly, his eyes bright with an almost feverish excitement, his notebook filling rapidly with observations. He no longer bothered with the pretense of academic detachment. "Remarkable, isn't it, Leo?" he'd exclaim, as a row of dryers inexplicably burst into a cacophony of alarm buzzers. "The barriers are thinning, the resonance is amplifying." He dismissed Silas's growing terror as the fear of the unknown, the resistance of an old mind clinging to outdated paradigms. "He seeks to muzzle it, Leo," Finch would say, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I believe it wishes to speak, perhaps through you. Perhaps it has chosen you, given your unique sensitivities." His insinuations about my connection to Danny, my unique sensitivities, became more pointed, more manipulative. He'd speak of sympathetic resonance, of how profound grief could create a conduit for energies seeking expression. He hinted that the rules were not only failing, but were perhaps even provoking the desviados, like prodding a sleeping beast. What if, he mused, his gaze intense, the only way to achieve a true equilibrium is not through suppression, but through a controlled, facilitated release? A dialogue? Imagine the knowledge, Leo, the closure that might be attained. He made it sound like a noble, even therapeutic endeavor, a way to transform the horror into something meaningful. But beneath the silken words, I sensed a cold, predatory hunger. The ordinary customers, the few who still braved the late hours, dwindled to almost none. Those who did come in often left in a hurry, unnerved by the oppressive atmosphere, the flickering lights, the machines that seemed to possess a malevolent will of their own. One woman fled screaming when a load of her freshly washed white sheets emerged from a dryer inexplicably stained with what looked like rusty handprints. The spin-and-fold was becoming a pariah, a place actively repelling the mundane world, cocooning itself in its own growing darkness. Even the usual city sounds, distant sirens, the rumble of late-night trucks, seemed to be muffled, as if the laundromat existed in a pocket dimension of its own making. The rules themselves began to backfire. Pouring the Lily Valley fabric softener down the drain at 1:11 a.m., once a ritual of quiet dread, now often triggered a violent surge of activity. Pipes would rattle, lights would explode, and once, a torrent of viscous, foul-smelling black sludge erupted from the service sink, flooding a section of the floor. Leaving dryer number 7 ajar seemed to invite something in, rather than release pressure. I'd hear scratching sounds from within its drum, and the cold spot around it intensified, an almost tangible presence. The crimson sock, when it appeared, now seemed to smolder with a faint internal heat, and reporting it to Silas only resulted in a fresh wave of poltergeist-like activity. The system was not just collapsing, it was actively turning against us. I felt myself adrift, the old certainties gone, Silas's authority waning, Finch's seductive theories pulling me towards an abyss. The laundromat was no longer a place of passive haunting. It was an active, hostile environment, and I was trapped in the escalating storm. The need to simply survive the shift was being replaced by a more urgent, desperate need to understand what was happening, to find some way to push back against the encroaching darkness, or at least to comprehend the rules of this terrifying new game. The old rulebook was being torn to shreds page by page, and the realization dawned that if any of us were to make it through, we would have to write our own. The breaking point came on a night when the floral party dress, which Silas had tried to keep locked in a metal footlocker in the office, somehow appeared draped over the central folding table,
its faded flowers seeming to bloom with an unhealthy phosphorescent light. Its taffeta sash was tied into a perfect, elegant noose. As Silas and I stared at it in horrified silence, Finch walked in, a thin, triumphant smile on his lips. "It seems," he said, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable note of authority, "that containment is no longer an option. The threads are demanding to be woven into a new pattern. And I believe, Leo, that you are the shuttle." The illusion of control was gone. The system had collapsed, and I was now unequivocally part of whatever terrible design was unfolding. Just when the despair felt absolute, a lifeline emerged from the most unexpected quarter. Gus O'Malley, a man I'd occasionally seen lurking near the spin-and-fold late at night, his face pale and perpetually anxious, finally approached me. He was a wiry, jittery man, probably in his late 40s, with eyes that darted around as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows at any moment. I'd always dismissed him as just another of Ashtabula's down-on-their-luck figures. But that night, as I stood outside trying to clear my head
when I nodded, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps even pity, crossed his face. "I used to work there," he said, his gaze skittering away. "Years ago. Didn't last long. Nobody does. Not really. Not if they got any sense." He then told me in a torrent of fragmented, fearful sentences about his own brief, terrifying tenure, about the moving clothes, the whispers, an incident involving a child's rocking horse left in the Lost and Found that had begun to rock violently on its own in the dead of night. He'd quit, fled Ashtabula for a while, but the place had called him back. "It gets its hooks in you," he shivered. "But there's someone you should talk to, someone who knows things, more than Blackwood lets on, more than that fancy-pants Finch fella wants anyone to know." Gus led me through the deserted back streets of Ashtabula, the silence broken only by the mournful cry of a distant train, to a small, unassuming clapboard house on the edge of the old tannery district. The porch light cast a warm, inviting glow, a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of the spin-and-fold. Inside, the house was a bibliophile's dream, crammed floor to ceiling with books, maps, and historical documents. Presiding over this archive was Eleanor Vance, a woman in her early 70s with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor. She was, Gus explained, a retired librarian and the town's unofficial historian, the linchpin of a small, informal group called the Ashtabula Vigil. Eleanor listened to my frantic, disjointed account of the events at the spin-and-fold with a calm, focused intensity that was strangely reassuring. She asked pointed questions, her gaze never wavering. When I mentioned Alastair Finch, a flicker of something cold and hard crossed her features. "Finch," she said, her voice tight. "He's no mere folklorist, Mr. Maxwell. He's a parasite. He seeks out places like the spin-and-fold, thin places, as some call them, not to understand them, but to exploit them. He's been on our radar for some time, drifting from one troubled town to another, leaving a trail of intensified disturbances." She then revealed the Vigil's purpose: to monitor Ashtabula's various anomalous hotspots, to understand their patterns, and, where possible, to mitigate their harm, all while remaining invisible to the wider world. The true revelation, however, came when Eleanor produced a heavy, leather-bound volume from a locked wooden chest. Its cover was bare, the leather cracked and faded with age. "This," she said, her voice hushed with reverence, "is the original ledger of Jedediah Abernathy, the man who built the spin-and-fold in 1933.
The pages within were filled with Abernathy's spidery, meticulous script, detailing not just the laundromat's financial transactions, but also his increasingly alarmed observations of its strange properties. He, too, had documented the moving clothes, the whispers, the inexplicable cold spots. He had been the first to try and codify a response, the genesis of Silas's rules. But Abernathy's notes went deeper, into far more disturbing territory. Abernathy hadn't just stumbled upon a thin place. His writings hinted that he had done something, perhaps unwittingly, during the construction, or through some esoteric practice he'd been involved in, that had tuned the building to these residual energies. He wrote of os desfiados, not as mere echoes, but as hungry threads, entities that fed on potent emotional detritus and could, under certain circumstances, woven or directed. The rules he developed were less about appeasement and more about a precarious, dangerous balance, small offerings to keep the threads from seeking larger, more animate prey. He'd even documented O Grande Emaranhado de 1968, referring to it as a feeding cycle that had been triggered by an attempt to unbind the threads by a previous reckless custodian.
The most chilling entries, however, concerned Abernathy's dawning realization that certain individuals acted as beacons or amplifiers for the threads. Their own emotional turmoil, particularly unresolved grief or guilt, drawing the entities to them and magnifying their power. He described one such individual, a young woman who had lost a child, whose mere presence in the laundromat seemed to cause the manifestations to spike wildly. As Eleanor read these passages aloud, her eyes met mine, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that Abernathy could have been writing about me and my consuming grief for Danny. Finch hadn't just found a conduit, he'd found a lightning rod. Eleanor explained that Finch's methods were far more insidious than simple academic curiosity. The Vigil believed he was attempting to orchestrate a controlled, amplified manifestation, using a potent emotional anchor, the floral dress, and a powerful beacon, me, to deliberately unravel the veil, not for knowledge, but for some kind of perverse power or direct communion with whatever lay beyond. He wasn't trying to understand the Desfiados, he was trying to unleash them, or bind them to his will. The collapse of Silas's rules wasn't just a sign of the entities growing stronger, it was a direct result of Finch's subtle, systematic dismantling of the old containments, paving the way for his own, far more dangerous ritual. Abernathy's ledger, however, also offered a sliver of hope, or at least a path for resistance. Amongst his fearful observations were notes on counterweaves and sealing patterns, rituals designed not to destroy the threads, which he believed impossible, but to pacify them, to re-establish a less hostile equilibrium, or to sever a beacon's connection. These methods were dangerous, requiring a precise understanding of the thread's nature and often a significant personal offering or sacrifice of emotional energy from the participants. It was a desperate gambit, but it was more than Silas's failing appeasements or Finch's predatory ambitions. It was a strategy. The discovery of Abernathy's hidden knowledge had redefined the game entirely. We were no longer just victims. We could, perhaps, become agents. Armed with the grim knowledge from Abernathy's ledger, Eleanor Vance outlined a desperate plan. Finch, she confirmed through the Vigil's discreet network, was indeed preparing for a major event. The upcoming date was the anniversary of O Grande Emaranhado de 1968, a night when, according to Abernathy, the veil was at its thinnest, and the hungry threads most receptive to influence.
Finch intended to use this confluence, along with the potent emotional charge of the floral party dress and my own resonant grief, to orchestrate a full-scale breach, a controlled unraveling that he believed would grant him unprecedented access to whatever power or entities lay beyond. The escalating chaos at the spin-and-fold was, in effect, Finch priming the pump, deliberately agitating the Desviados to make them more malleable for his ritual. Eleanor proposed a counter-ritual, a sealing pattern, adapted from Abernathy's most desperate and arcane notes. It was a complex, dangerous undertaking designed to disrupt Finch's efforts and, hopefully, to re-spool the agitated threads, forcing them back into a state of relative dormancy. The ritual required precise timing, specific symbolic components, salt, iron, ash, and woven elements, and, most crucially, a focal point of immense emotional energy to act as a counter-beacon, drawing the threads away from Finch's control and into the sealing pattern. It was chillingly clear who that focal point had to be. My grief for Danny, the very thing that made me a magnet for the Desviados, was now our most potent weapon.
The decision to participate was not made lightly. The thought of deliberately channeling my deepest pain, of offering up the raw essence of my loss as a component in some esoteric ritual, was terrifying. It felt like a violation, a desecration of Danny's memory. Yet the alternative, allowing Finch to succeed, to potentially unleash something cataclysmic upon Ashtabula, or to become his unwilling psychic battery, was unthinkable. Silas, when Eleanor and Gus finally brought him into their confidence, was initially skeptical, deeply distrustful of anything that deviated from his ingrained routines. But even he could see the old ways were failing, that Finch was outmaneuvering him. The sight of Abernathy's ledger, the familiar handwriting detailing rituals that predated his own knowledge, finally swayed him. Martha Thorne, surprisingly, also agreed to help, her usual cynicism tinged with a grim resignation. "Might as well go down fighting the damned lint balls," she'd rasped. The days leading up to the anniversary were a blur of clandestine preparations. Under Eleanor's guidance, we gathered the necessary components. Gus, using his old employee knowledge, scouted the spin-and-fold's layout, identifying potential weak points in Finch's preparations and the best locations for our own ritualistic anchors. Silas, drawing on decades of instinct, monitored Finch's movements, his comings and goings, trying to anticipate his exact timing. Martha, with a surprising knowledge of local herbalism gleaned from her grandmother, prepared mixtures of salt and dried herbs Abernathy had described as thread binders. My role was less tangible, more internal. Eleanor instructed me to focus on Danny, not on the guilt, but on the love, the cherished memories, the sharp, undiminished pain of his absence. "The threads feed on raw emotion, Leo," she'd said gently. "We must offer them something pure, something they cannot easily corrupt, to draw them into the seal." The plan was to intercept Finch's ritual at its peak. He would likely be using the main bank of dryers, particularly dryer number 7, the 7th Psi, which Abernathy's notes identified as a primary confluence point, as the nexus of his working. We would create our sealing pattern around this area, attempting to create a psychic whirlpool that would divert the energy he was summoning. It was a desperate, almost foolhardy plan, relying on ancient, half-understood principles against a man who seemed to possess a chillingly modern, manipulative understanding of these same forces. The risk of failure was immense, the potential consequences catastrophic, not just for us, but for anyone or anything caught in the ensuing psychic backlash.
On the eve of the anniversary, a heavy, unnatural stillness descended upon Ashtabula. The usual lake winds died down, and the sky was a bruised, starless canvas. The spin-and-fold, when I arrived for what I knew would be my most perilous shift, felt like the calm eye of an impending hurricane. Finch was already there, not attempting to hide his preparations any longer. He had arranged several old tarnished silver bowls around the bank of dryers, and the floral party dress was laid out on the central folding table, not like a garment, but like an offering on an altar. He greeted me with a serene, almost beatific smile. "Ah, Leo, you're just in time. The concert is about to begin. And you, my friend, have a starring role." There was no more pretense, no more academic charm. Only the cold, unwavering certainty of a man on the verge of achieving a terrible, long-sought ambition. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the low hum of the laundromat seemed to deepen, to resonate with a primal, hungry anticipation. The threads were tightening, and the weave was about to be tested.
The anniversary night of O Grande Emareñado descended upon the spin-and-fold, not with a bang, but with a suffocating, unnatural hush. The usual hum of the machines had subsided into a low, resonant thrum, like the breathing of some colossal, slumbering beast. Alastair Finch moved with a chilling, priest-like calm, lighting thin, black candles in the tarnished silver bowls he'd arranged in a complex geometric pattern around the bank of dryers, the floral party dress its ghastly centerpiece. The air grew colder, the scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and dusty, like long-disturbed earth, becoming almost overpowering. My own heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a counterpoint to the laundromat's ominous, deepening pulse. As the clock ticked past midnight, Finch began his invocation. His voice, usually so cultured and smooth, took on a strange, guttural quality, reciting words in a language I didn't recognize, but which seemed to scrape at the very edges of my sanity. The floral dress on the central table began to glow with a faint, sickly luminescence, its faded patterns writhing as if alive. Tendrils of shadow, thicker and more defined than any I had seen before, started to coalesce in the corners of the room, stretching and probing like questing pseudopods. The temperature plummeted, and the flickering fluorescent lights finally gave up, plunging us into a near-total darkness, illuminated only by Finch's malevolent black candles and the unholy glow of the dress. This was our cue. From the shadows near the back entrance, Eleanor Vance, Silas, Gus, and Martha emerged, their faces grim and set. Eleanor began a low, chanting countermelody to Finch's harsh invocation, her voice surprisingly strong and steady. Silas and Gus moved quickly, placing small, iron-bound wooden markers, inscribed with Abernathy's sealing patterns, at key points around Finch's ritual circle, while Martha scattered her mixtures of salt and thread-binding herbs. Finch, momentarily startled by our appearance, let out a harsh, barking laugh. "The local historical society, I presume. A valiant, if utterly futile, gesture. You cannot stop what is already in motion. The threads are hungry, and tonight they shall feast." He turned his attention back to the dress, his voice rising in a crescendo of alien syllables. The dress levitated a few inches off the table, spinning slowly, its light intensifying, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls.
From within the drums of the surrounding dryers, a chorus of whispers erupted, hundreds, thousands of voices, all murmuring in unison, a sibilant, chilling tide of sound. The shadowy tendrils in the room grew bolder, thicker, some of them brushing against me with a touch that was both icy cold and disturbingly, intimately familiar. Then, from the heart of the swirling shadows, a form began to coalesce. It was small, indistinct at first, but as it solidified, my blood ran cold. It was the shape of a young boy. Danny. "Leo." The voice was a perfect echo of my brother's, laced with a heartbreaking spectral sorrow. "Leo, you left me. I was so scared, Leo. But you can bring me back now. Just let go. Let the threads take your pain. We can be together again." The apparition reached out a small, shadowy hand. Finch watched, his face alight with a terrible, triumphant glee. Yes, the beacon resonates. The conduit is open. Come, threads, come and be woven anew. He raised his arms, and the shadowy tendrils surged towards me, towards the image of Danny. My grief, my guilt, my desperate longing, it all threatened to overwhelm me, to make me reach out, to accept the false promise. But Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos, strong and unwavering. "Now, Leo, focus, not the guilt, the love, the truth of him. Anchor them with that." Her words, Abernathy's wisdom, resonated.
I closed my eyes, not against the horror, but to focus inward, to gather every precious, untainted memory of Danny, every ounce of love. And then, with a ragged sob that tore from my very soul, I offered it, not to the grasping threads, not to Finch's insatiable hunger, but to the sealing pattern, to the desperate hope of containment. A blinding white light erupted from the iron-bound markers, from the lines of salt and herbs, connecting, forming a crackling, incandescent web around Finch's ritual. The shadowy tendrils recoiled as if burned. The apparition of Danny flickered, its sorrowful face contorting into an expression of inhuman rage, before dissolving into a shriek of frustrated static. Finch screamed, a high, thin sound of disbelief and fury. "No! My weaving! You're disrupting the pattern! The threads, they need the sorrow, the despair!" The light from our seal intensified, a vortex of pure, concentrated emotional energy, my love for Danny its incandescent core. The floral dress on the table combusted, erupting in a flash of sickly green flame, then collapsing into a pile of smoking ash. The chorus of whispers faltered, then rose into a deafening cacophony of rage and pain, before being abruptly, violently silenced. The shadowy tendrils thrashed, then began to retract, to unravel, drawn inexorably into the vortex of our seal, like yarn being rewound onto a spool at impossible speed. The laundromat groaned, the very walls seeming to shudder under the strain. It was a battle of wills, of energies, fought on a battlefield of sorrow and memory, in the heart of a haunted laundromat, and the outcome hung precariously in the balance. The implosion, when it came, was not a physical explosion, but one of psychic force, a silent, devastating concussion of unraveling energies. As the last of the shadowy tendrils were sucked into the incandescent vortex of our sealing pattern, Alistair Finch let out a final, choked cry. His body, caught in the backlash of his own disrupted ritual, began to fray. Threads of his tweed jacket, then his shirt, then his very skin seemed to loosen, to unspool,
as if he were a poorly woven garment coming apart at the seams. His form flickered, grew transparent, and then, with a soft, sighing sound that was swallowed by the laundromat's sudden, profound silence, he was simply gone. All that remained where he had stood was a small pile of dust and a few stray, lifeless threads, indistinguishable from the usual detritus of the old building. The blinding light of the ceiling pattern pulsed, once, twice, then slowly faded, leaving us in the dim, emergency lighting that had flickered on. The oppressive coldness lifted. The air, while still stale and heavy with the scent of ozone and burnt fabric, the dress, no longer felt actively malevolent. The spin-and-fold was quiet, a deep, echoing silence that was more unnerving than its usual cacophony of ghostly hums and whispers. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting has ceased. Silas, Gus, and Martha were pale and shaken, leaning against the silent machines for support. Eleanor Vance, though visibly drained, stood tall, her eyes surveying the scene with a grim satisfaction. As for me, I felt hollowed out. The act of offering my purest memories of Danny, of transmuting my grief into a weapon, had taken a profound toll. It wasn't that the sorrow was gone. It had simply changed. The sharp, jagged edges smoothed, the consuming fire banked into a bed of embers, still warm, still present, but no longer defining my entire existence. In its place was a strange, new kind of emptiness, but also a quiet clarity. The phantom limb of Danny's absence still ached, but the infection of guilt felt cleansed. I had faced the worst caricature of my loss, weaponized by an outside force, and I had not broken. I had, in some small vital way, reclaimed him from the maw of the spin-and-fold.
In the days and weeks that followed, the laundromat settled into a new, uneasy stasis. The overt, aggressive manifestations ceased. The moving clothes, the disembodied voices, the targeted hauntings, they were gone. But the place was not cleansed, not entirely. It was more like a wound that had been stitched closed, but still bore a deep, indelible scar. There was a residual awareness, a faint hum beneath the surface, a sense that the desfiados, the hungry threads, were still present, though now dormant, pacified, perhaps even wary. The ceiling pattern, Eleanor explained, hadn't destroyed them, but had re-established a kind of boundary, a new set of terms for their existence within the laundromat's confines. The most significant transformation, however, was within me. I found I possessed a new, heightened sensitivity to the emotional residue of the place. I could almost feel the lingering imprints on certain garments, a faint echo of joy from a child's playsuit, a pang of sorrow from a widow's discarded shawl, a flicker of anger from a forgotten work shirt. It wasn't overwhelming, more like a subtle background static, a new layer of sensory input. Eleanor believed that my role as the counter-beacon in the ritual had permanently attuned me to these frequencies. I had become a living dowsing rod for sorrow, a human barometer for the psychic weather of the spin-and-fold. The old rules, Silas's rigid list of appeasements, were now obsolete. They had been designed for a different kind of interaction, a passive defense against a creeping encroachment. What was needed now was something else entirely. The disappearance of Alistair Finch was noted, briefly, in the local Ashtabula Chronicle. A missing person presumed to have moved on. Another transient academic leaving no forwarding address. The vigil made no attempt to correct the record. Some doors, as Martha had said, were best left not only unopened, but forgotten.
Kevin, the young employee, slowly recovered from his catatonic state, though he had no memory of the threads or the incident with dryer number 7, his mind having mercifully blanked the trauma. He never returned to the spin and fold. The floral party dress was gone, reduced to ash, its potent, sorrowful anchor neutralized. But the memory of its unholy glow and the terrible power it had channeled would remain etched in my mind. The spin and fold had been irrevocably altered, and so had I. The weight of my guilt for Danny had not vanished, but it had been transmuted into something else, a responsibility, a strange custodial duty. The battle was over, but the war, I suspected, was a permanent condition of this place. The threads were an intrinsic part of its fabric, woven into its very foundations. They could be managed, perhaps, even understood on some level, but never truly eradicated. I had faced the absolute, the raw, hungry void that lay beneath the surface of the mundane, and I had, somehow, survived. But survival came with a price, a transference of knowledge, a transformation of self that I was only just beginning to comprehend. The laundromat had taken a piece of me, but it had also given me something in return, a terrible, unwelcome clarity. Months have passed since that harrowing night, since Alastair Finch became another forgotten thread in the vast, indifferent tapestry of existence. The spin and fold still stands, a weary sentinel on its forgotten Ashtabula corner, its machines still churning, its lights still flickering with a tired, jaundiced glow. But it's a different place now, or perhaps we are different within it. The oppressive, aggressive malevolence is gone, replaced by a quieter, more watchful atmosphere. The silence is deeper, imbued not with threat, but with a kind of ancient, knowing resignation. The old rules, Silas's meticulously typed list of nightly essentials, are gone, gathering dust in a forgotten drawer. They are relics of a past engagement, artifacts from a battle whose terms have fundamentally changed. The disappearance of Alastair Finch was noted, briefly, in the local Ashtabula Chronicle, a missing person presumed to have moved on, another transient academic leaving no forwarding address. The vigil made no attempt to correct the record. Some doors...
I still work the graveyard shift. Leaving never truly felt like an option. The threads, as Gus O'Malley had warned, had their hooks in me, but not in the parasitic way they'd held him. My connection to the spin and fold, forged in the crucible of that counter-ritual, is now less a haunting and more a stewardship. Silas, Martha, Eleanor, Gus and I, we are the new, unofficial custodians. We are a vigilia da lavanderia, as Eleanor Riley calls us. Our task is no longer one of blind appeasement, but of active, informed vigilance. My heightened sensitivity to the emotional residue has become our early warning system. I can feel the subtle shifts, the faint stirrings of old sorrows, the nascent tangles of new despair before they can coalesce into something more potent. We don't follow prescribed rituals anymore. Instead, we practice what Eleanor terms sympathetic mitigation. If I sense a particularly strong or volatile emotional imprint on a garment or in a specific area, we don't try to banish it with arcane ools. We try to soothe it. Sometimes it's as simple as Martha leaving a small, anonymously offered kindness for a struggling customer whose laundry practically radiates anxiety. Other times, Eleanor will quietly research the history of a particularly resonant item left behind, seeking to understand its story, to give its echo a kind of respectful acknowledgement. Silas, for his part, has become an expert at identifying and gently retiring garments that feel too heavy,
too saturated with sorrow to be safely circulated, consigning them not to a locked bin, but to a quiet, respectful burning, their ashes scattered to the winds over Lake Erie. My relationship with Danny's memory has found a new, bittersweet equilibrium. The raw, consuming guilt has receded, replaced by a profound, enduring love and a quiet acceptance of the loss. The apparition Finch had conjured, that grotesque caricature of my brother's pain, paradoxically helped to exorcise the worst of my own. In offering up my true memories, my untainted love as a shield, I somehow reclaimed him from the shadows. I still think of him every day, but now the memories bring a warmth, a quiet strength, rather than a fresh wave of self-recrimination. I visit his favorite spot by the old creek when I go back to my hometown, not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what was. The Spin and Fold will never be an ordinary laundromat. The desfiados, the hungry threads, are an indelible part of its essence, woven into the very mortar and linoleum. They are the accumulated sorrows of a town, the discarded griefs, the lingering echoes of countless lives. But they are no longer an unbridled, consuming force. They are managed, respected even, in a strange way. We understand now that their hunger stems from a kind of desperate, fragmented yearning for recognition, for completion. By acknowledging the stories they carry, by treating the lingering emotions with a careful, almost tender regard, we seem to keep the worst of their hunger at bay. It's a delicate balance, a constant, quiet negotiation with the unseen. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is asleep and the only sound is the gentle hum of a resting machine, I can still feel them, the faint, rustling presence of the threads, like silk brushing against the edges of my perception. They know me. They remember the night the pattern was broken and rewoven. There's no malice in their presence now, more a kind of awareness, a shared understanding. I am no longer just Leo Maxwell, the haunted night attendant. I am part of the fabric of the Spin and Fold, a thread myself, woven into its strange, ongoing story. The work is unending, the vigil perpetual. But in this quiet, constant tending of sorrows, in this strange stewardship of forgotten heartaches, I have found a measure of peace, a purpose I never sought, but can no longer imagine living without. The rules may not matter anymore, but the stories, the echoes, the threads that bind us all, they matter more than ever.